Good afternoon. So I want to begin by saying that this is very much a work in progress, as I was only able to track down some of the data for my presentation today very recently. And I also want to say that when I was asked to produce a title, I just put some words together that I like the sound of. But I'd like to remove the word ordained women from my talk. So we're not talking about ordained women today, but I am talking about Mormon Feminists, the LDS Church, and tracking tensions over time. Okay, so Mormon feminists are those that identify as such, because the feminism is an F word often within LDS culture. People are Mormon feminists when they identify as Mormon feminists. Broadly, very, very broadly, they divide into two generations. The second wave of the movement, or second wavers as I'm going to call them, who participated in Mormon feminism from the 1960s through to the 1990s, and even maybe through to today, but their origin is in that earlier generation of the movement. And third wavers, who are a younger generation, who largely participate in the social media version of the movement, which started out in blogs, but is largely existing in Facebook. And that movement is still going strong, but it's been undergoing a number of changes that we're going to talk about today. So I've been studying the Mormon feminist movement for the last 5 years, and as was mentioned before, I also participate in the movement. I've probably been participating in the movement since about 2005. At that time, in 2012, 2013, a number of people felt that their participation in Mormon feminist spaces online helped them to stay active in the church. And people expressed that idea pretty regularly in Facebook groups at that time. And I thought that was interesting, and I was very much a, full, not a full professor, but, a full-time teaching art historian at the time. And then when a friend asked me if I wanted to write a paper testing some of this stuff, I said yes, and it's changed the course of my career. So Jessica Finnegan and I conducted 2 surveys of the Mormon feminist movement in 2013 and then again in 2015. The 2015 survey results are reported in the Ordained Women in Emergent Feminism book that was just referred to. Okay, so since then I've spent a lot of time reading and talking to people about the history of the Mormon feminist movement. And I realized that second wave feminists also had their claims about their movement. So if I just said that third wavers claimed that their participation in 2013, 2012 in the movement helped them to stay active by helping them to negotiate their experiences in the LDS Church. The second wavers also had their claims that they made about their movement. The most famous of which is that the movement went underground in the 90s after the September 6th excommunications in 1993. And I've heard this went underground quite a lot. This is terrible. I should stop doing that. Okay, but the word underground reappears quite a lot, and it took me a long time to figure out exactly what that meant, and I've had a lot of conversations about this. Also, third wavers have complained second wavers have complained that the third wave of the movement is largely repeating the conversations that had already existed in the 70s and 80s, sometime with the impression that if we just went back and read all of their literature, that might somehow resolve our issues, or we no longer needed to have our own conversation, and that might be a little bit of a gross exaggeration. Okay, so Jessica and I conducted our surveys in 2013 and 2015, and while I am working on an ongoing book project about the history and sociology of Mormon feminism, and last summer I came in contact with a reader survey in a 1989 edition or issue of The Exponent 2, and then very recently I found reports from 2 other surveys. Another survey that was conducted in 1979, 1980, and again in 1997. And this was like the most exciting thing that has happened in my life in like the last 6 months. Is finding these reader surveys. which are very short, but report just enough information to be interesting, and just enough information for me to begin to compare some of the descriptive statistics that we collected from the 2013 and 2015 surveys with those of the earlier generation. And so part of what I want to do today is to talk about the ways in which these snapshots of the Mormon feminist community reveal surprisingly consistent patterns of behavior in Mormon feminists across generations. And the one movement did not beget the other movement. The third wave movement largely started independently in 2004 with Lisa Butterworth founding the Feminist Mormon Housewives blog, and then eventually that became connected and then aware of the second wave movement. So these are movements that started independently of each other, and yet there are some really surprising comparative statistics here, and I want to talk about that a little bit. So the analysis for this presentation is more of a high-level one and a distant reading than a really close reading of a particular study, because I'm involving a whole bunch of studies here. And then at the end of this, I show a few other graphs from a few other studies. And so it's just a big study mashup today. So bear with me, please. Okay, so the exponent reader surveys, in the reports in the exponent itself, they were really kind enough to give us the total survey responses together with their response rates. So I don't know who had the foresight in the 70s and 80s and 90s to know that we in the 2000s, would really need this information, but we have it. And we have pretty substantial response rates from these exponent to reader surveys. I do want to point out that the Mormon feminist community doesn't just live in the space of the exponent of the exponent, but that the exponent was the major publication for the second wave of the movement. Okay, so we've got response rates then of about 49%, 38%, and 35%. So that's a fairly high response rate, even if it isn't a random sample of that community. When Jessica and I conducted our surveys in social media of Mormon feminists, for starters, we had no way of knowing exactly how big the community was that we were surveying, and we had no way of understanding how to conduct a random sample. Today, I think we would have a better idea of how to conduct a random sample of people who were members of specific Facebook groups, but at that time, there weren't so many Facebook groups, and we didn't know how to measure it. We did snowball sampling online, where we created a survey and we shared it, and other people shared it, and we got pretty big, substantial responses. Then last year, I was able to figure out how to create a measure of the Mormon feminist community in the 5 main Facebook groups, the 5 main closed Facebook groups that the Mormon feminist community lives in Facebook. Not to say that there aren't other participants of the third wave movement who participate in other ways, but in creating an unduplicated member list of all of those groups, we were able to get to the number of about 6,700. So, and the community in 2013 would have been smaller. So whatever that means, there are limitations to these statistics, but as time goes on, maybe it wasn't so terrible, the method that we did. But, with a grain of salt, and I'm not going to say that these are perfect statistics. So let's move on. So these are very basic demographic statistics. So in the second wave of the movement, there were far more women participating in Mormon feminism than there are in the third wave of the movement. The third wave of the movement seems to include more men. And if you participate in these spaces, there are men who regularly participate, and a number of men who have been longtime participants of the movement in the third wave, where that seems to be less true of the second wave. Okay, the movement is very white. And very consistently white. And if you participate in the third wave of the movement and happen to be in the Feminist Mormon Housewives Facebook group, you'll understand how difficult and problematic this is. But it is a very white movement, and I think that it's also a very straight movement. It's a very middle class / upper middle class movement. It's a very cisgendered movement, and so these are things that also describe the movement, and they're important in understanding how things play out, or at least that's a hypothesis that I'm working with, at the intersection of whiteness with upper middle classness, with cisgendered womanness and straightness, creates a great deal of privilege, and that kind of distance from the full privilege of not being a man creates a great deal of tension and fear, more so than perhaps if the movement was less white. Or that is, again, a hypothesis. Again, work in progress here. We're just throwing some things out. Okay, so the earlier generation, the second wave Mormon feminists, were older when they began participating. It was an older movement. The third wave feminist movement here is much younger. And so, and we can kind of track the population of the exponent to readership kind of through time. About every 10 years, they get about 10 years older. So they're not bringing in a lot of younger women as that movement developed. And you can see that they've got like in 1997, less than 8% of the exponent readership was younger than 40. So I mean that's where nearly all of the membership of the third wave is younger than 40. So people at very different stages of life, and probably also that's going to impact how people are responding to the LDS Church. Because if you have a younger group that are maybe not yet attached and not yet having a lot of children and are still somewhat single and still feeling like they have a degree of flexibility that maybe people with established families and lots of children may not necessarily feel that they have, they may feel less flexibility and therefore more tension. In some ways with the LDS Church. Okay, education. This is a very highly educated group across the board, which is that in the somewhere between 75 and 85% of the second wave movement had a bachelor's degree or higher, and we're pretty consistent in holding at about 79% with the third wave of the movement. And this is with a substantial number of people also having master's degrees or bachelor's degrees or MDs or JDs. This is a very well-educated movement. And that differs from the larger Mormon population, let's see, which are far less educated in America. So in 2009, Pew showed that about 28% of LDS adults in the U.S. had a bachelor's degree or higher. So this is like at the extremely well-educated end of the movement, and that plays an important role in the movement. And again, a fair bit of consistency over time. Okay, one of the biggest places where we get discrepancy and difference is in activity rates. So these are not comparable statistics in the sense that they weren't measuring the exact same thing. The Exponent Reader Survey just asked people to identify as active or very active, and the numbers here represent the active plus the very active. And in mine and Jessica Finnegan's surveys, we asked people if we considered the active to be you attended church at least 2 to 3 times a month or more, with the biggest group of that saying that they attend church every week. But one thing we see is that while the number of those who are active declines over time with the exponent 2, we kind of tick down a few percentage points at each iteration of the survey. What we see with the third wave of the movement is that between 2013 and 2015, just a 2-year time span, that we lose a significant chunk of activity in Mormon feminism. And there is a very, very identifiable reason for that, because of course, in June of 2014, Kate Kelly is who is one of the founders of Ordained Women. So I did mention Ordained Women. There you go. Is very publicly excommunicated, and And the Mormon feminist community really, in the third wave, really reacts to that in a very strong way, where there are other excommunications happening with the exponent, or at the time in which the exponent is doing their surveys. And sorry, this is I couldn't find what better way to do this, but on the bottom we have a timeline from 1979 representing the first survey and through to 2015 representing the last survey. The blue lines represent the activity rates, so the blue are for the exponent and then the red for the third wave of the movement. And then all the tall, yellowy, orange lines represent big public excommunications. So in 1980, you've got the excommunication of Sonia Johnson. In 93, you've got the September 6th. In 95, you've got Janice Allred. In 2000, you've got Margaret Toscano. Again, very public excommunications. And while the activity rate in the exponent 2 community ticks down, it's gradual. And it seems to be a gradual ticking down. Though if you ask those women, I think that to kind of expand and explore this a little more, they would tell you that all of their daughters left the church during this time. And that this is what creates a kind of lost generation of Mormon feminists in the later 90s and in the very early 2000s. And that's why we have very few third wave Mormon feminists who have mothers who are second wave Mormon feminists. Really just a couple of handfuls. I am actually one of those people, but like total unicorn here. So, but we have a much stronger reaction to a single excommunication. And we should also point out here that with the second wave of the movement, there were other difficult things that were happening for Mormon feminists. There was the church fighting against ERA in the late 70s and the early 80s, and there was a general period of retrenchment and kind of doubling down on traditional and conservative gender roles in the early 80s and even kind of into the early 90s just a bit. And so there are lots of things happening, but the older generation doesn't respond by withdrawing their activity from the church. But the younger generation definitely does. One way that I would explain this would be that the younger generation, the third wave, because they're on social media, they see every news report that mentions the LDS Church, every Mormon newsroom report gets analyzed. Every time anybody in the church says anything, or if there's something particularly awful that happens on a particular Sunday in a particular ward, that the whole of the community knows about it. And so, and very, very, very quickly. And so the sharing of information, which happened very much during the second wave of the movement, is a very more intense situation in the third wave of the movement. And the way that Mormon feminists of the third movement often respond is by withdrawing activity. When the church does things they really don't like, there can be a withdrawing of activity. Although sometimes those same individuals will return, but often a withdrawal. And even though the last survey we did was in 2015, that was at the beginning of 2015, and doesn't include a further survey asking Mormon feminists about their activity rates after what in the Mormon feminist community we call the exclusion policy, or what was called earlier today the gay policy. And I would imagine that we would see the numbers tick down a further 20 or 30 points as a result of this. And again, that's just a guessing. But today there are very few prominent members of the Mormon feminist community who are still fully active because of this particular cycle. So we can see that there is something of an excommunication cycle in the LDS Church, where excommunications happen every so often of prominent Mormon feminist voices, and the community responds. But today we might say that the community responds in a more dramatic way, with bigger shifts and swings in LDS Church activity. Okay, but that's not entirely the picture either, actually. Because the exponent community never really claimed people like Sonia Johnson. Sonia Johnson is mentioned exactly twice in the archives of Exponent 2. And so it was more of, it seemed to me, as somebody who's doing both history and sociology of the Mormon feminist movement, that there were camps there were camps, and those camps didn't necessarily have a lot of crossover, and those women in one camp didn't necessarily claim the women in another camp as their sisters, as their Mormon feminist sisters, in the way that Mormon feminists might do today. And I'm going to jump over. So in a different project a couple of years ago, and again, this is the mashup of projects, I wanted to try to understand something about the overlap of women in these different groups. And I created a list of about 800 women. The Exponent 2 were kind enough to always list new subscribers, and that's great. There are also lists of people from who are involved with Mormon Women's Forum, and then there is a list of people who attended the first Mormon feminist retreat in Nauvoo in 1982. So there are all these lists, and I put together a list of more than 800 names. There are just 3 individuals who participated in all 3 things that I can determine. So we're really talking about very distinct camps. And so this is my bad attempt at a Venn diagram with very little overlap, made very quickly last night. So, but I was able to, in the fall, do a kind of census of the 5 main Mormon feminist groups on Facebook, and there's a tremendous amount of overlap. There is a tremendous amount of overlap in the populations of these groups. And so the movement today is very much a more connected movement, with people participating in multiple groups and camps without a single camp identity. And so So we've got a lot of interesting things happen. I'm going to wrap up now. We've got a lot of interesting things happening within Mormon feminism, both a lot of consistency over time, but also differences in the way in which these 2 generations of the same movement both respond to the LDS Church, respond to the excommunications, and what Joanna Brooks has referred to as the excommunication cycle, but also in the ways that they connect with each other. And part of that has to do with the internet versus newsletters and magazines. But we can see that the third wave of the movement is much more tight-knit. So when Kate Kelly was excommunicated, there were a lot of people who claimed her as their Mormon feminist sister. And it wasn't just, oh, that thing happened to another woman in a different camp, and we don't actually talk about that. So we're seeing a lot of patterns. The same kinds of women in 2 different generations become Mormon feminists. They maybe became Mormon feminists at different stages in their life cycle, and then grouped together with women of similar ages and demographics and identity. But they also then are behaving slightly differently, and that impacts the way that they connect with other camps of Mormon feminists. So I know that I am out of time, and so I will just leave it there. Thank you.